The dust hung in the air like something waiting. Carson Hale had been riding fence line for 3 hours when he saw the boy standing in the middle of the road. Just standing there. No horse. No wagon tracks leading in or out. Just a child, maybe 10 years old, thin as a rail, holding his hat in both hands like he was at a funeral. Carson pulled his mare to a stop 20 feet out. The boy didn't move. "You lost," Carson called. The boy shook his head. Slowly, deliberately, Carson dismounted, boots hitting the hard pan with a soft crunch. The sun was high and mean, the kind that pressed down on a man's shoulders and made him feel older than he was. He was 42, felt like 60 most days. "You hurt?" The boy shook his head again. Carson took a few steps closer. The kid's clothes were torn at the knees, dust-caked, and his face was streaked with something darker than dirt. Dried tears, maybe. Or blood. "What's your name?" "Eli." "Where's your folks?" "Eli." The boy's jaw tightened. His knuckles went white around the brim of his hat. "Gone." Carson felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd heard that word before. Knew the weight it carried. Gone didn't mean away. It meant buried. It meant alone. He crouched down so he was eye level with the boy. "How long you been out here?" "2 days. Maybe 3. You got water?" Eli nodded toward a tin canteen lying in the dirt a few feet away. It was dented, empty. Carson stood and handed the boy his own canteen. Eli took it with both hands and drank slow, controlled. Not desperate. That told Carson something. The kid had discipline. Someone had taught him how to survive. "Where you headed?" Carson asked. Eli wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Nowhere. Nowhere's a long walk." The boy looked up at him then, and Carson saw it the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from lack of sleep. It came from carrying something too heavy for too long. "Sir," Eli said quietly, "can you carry my brother?" Carson's eyes narrowed. "Your brother?" Eli pointed down the road, past a bend where the scrub brush thickened near a dry creek bed. "He's back there. He can't walk no more." Carson didn't ask why. He just started walking. The creek bed was shallow, mostly rock and brittle grass. Eli led him around the bend, and that's when Carson saw the second boy. He was smaller, maybe 7, lying in the shade of a twisted juniper tree, legs stretched out in front of him, head tilted back against the trunk. His face was pale, lips cracked, and his breathing came in short, shallow gasps. Carson knelt beside him. The boy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Hey there," Carson said softly. "What's your name?" "Samuel," the boy whispered. Carson looked at his legs. Both were wrapped in strips of cloth, stained dark. He peeled back one of the wrappings carefully. The boy flinched but didn't cry out. The ankle was broken, swollen, bruised deep purple. "Probably happened days ago. He fell," Eli said from behind him. "Off the wagon. When it happened." Carson didn't press. He pulled the cloth back over the ankle and stood. "Can you carry him?" Eli asked again. Carson looked down at Samuel, then back at Eli. "Yeah," he said. "I can carry him." He scooped Samuel up as gently as he could, one arm under his back, the other beneath his knees. The boy weighed almost nothing. Carson could feel every rib through his shirt. "Your place far?" Eli asked. 3 miles west." Eli nodded. He picked up his hat, set it back on his head, and started walking without another word. Carson followed. They didn't talk much on the way back. The sun shifted lower, casting long shadows across the valley. Carson's mare trailed behind them, reins loose. She knew the way home. Samuel drifted in and out of sleep, his head resting against Carson's chest. Every now and then, he'd mumble something, names, maybe, or pieces of a memory Carson couldn't make sense of. Eli walked ahead, steady and silent. His shoulders were squared, his steps even. He didn't look back once. Carson watched him and wondered what kind of life made a boy that steady, that quiet, that alone. By the time they reached the ranch, the sky had turned the color of rust. The house was small, wood-framed, with a sagging porch and a barn that leaned slightly to the left. It wasn't much, but it was his. Eli stopped at the edge of the yard and waited. Carson carried Samuel up onto the porch and nudged the door open with his boot. Inside, the air was cooler. Still. He laid the boy down on the cot near the stove and covered him with a wool blanket. Samuel's eyes opened halfway. "Eli, right outside," Carson said. "He's safe." The boy's eyes closed again. Carson stepped back onto the porch. Eli was still standing in the same spot, hands at his sides, staring at the ground. "You coming in or not?" Eli looked up. For a moment he didn't move. Then he walked forward, slow, like he was testing whether the ground would hold. Carson held the door open. Eli stepped inside. Carson set a pot of water on the stove and lit the fire. The flames licked up around the iron, casting flickering light across the walls. He didn't say anything. Neither did Eli. The boy stood near the doorway, watching his brother sleep. His face was unreadable. Carson filled 2 tin cups with water from the pump and set them on the table. "Sit," he said. Eli hesitated, then sat. Carson sat across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and Samuel's shallow breathing. "How long since you ate?" Carson asked. "Yesterday." "Maybe." Carson stood and pulled a loaf of bread from the cupboard. He sliced off 2 thick pieces and set them in front of Eli along with a jar of preserves. Eli stared at the bread like it might vanish if he blinked. "Go on," Carson said. The boy ate slowly, methodically, like he was afraid it might be the last meal he'd get. Carson poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned back in his chair. "You gonna tell me what happened?" Eli stopped chewing. He set the bread down and wiped his hands on his pants. "We were on the trail," he said quietly, "headed to Fort Collins. My ma and pa, me and Samuel. We had a wagon, some supplies." He paused, took a breath. 3 men stopped us. Said they wanted the wagon. Pa told them no. Carson's jaw tightened. "They shot him," Eli said. His voice didn't shake. "Then they shot Ma. Samuel tried to run and he fell off the back. Hit the ground hard. I grabbed him and we hid in the brush till they left." He picked up the bread again. Took another bite. "Been walking ever since." Carson stared into his coffee. He'd heard stories like this before. Too many of them. The kind that ended with unmarked graves and children wandering alone until they didn't wander anymore. "You know who they were?" Carson asked. Eli shook his head. "Never seen 'em before." "You remember what they looked like?" "One had a scar across his face. Another had a brown coat, torn at the shoulder." Carson nodded slowly. He knew men like that, knew the type. Drifters, outlaws, men who took what they wanted because no one stopped them. "You planning to go after them?" Eli asked. Carson looked up. The boy's eyes were steady, not hopeful, not afraid, just waiting. "No," Carson said. Eli nodded, like he'd expected that answer. "But I'm not turning you out either," Carson added. Eli blinked. "Why not?" "Because your brother can't walk, and you got nowhere else to go." The boy looked down at his hands. His fingers were calloused, dirt under the nails. Hands that had worked, hands that had carried. "We can work," Eli said. "Samuel too, once he's better. We can earn our keep." Carson shook his head. "Didn't ask you to." "Then why help us?" Carson set his cup down. "Because someone should have helped you 2 days ago, and they didn't." Eli stared at him for a long moment. Then he looked away. The next morning, Carson rode into town. The general store was half empty, the shelves dusty. The clerk, a man named Petey with thinning hair and a nervous smile, looked up as Carson walked in. "Morning, Hale." "Morning." Carson bought bandages, salve, a small bottle of laudanum, and a bag of flour. Petey rang it up without comment. "Heard you took in a couple strays," Petey said as he wrapped the goods in brown paper. Carson paused. "Word travels fast." "Always does." Petey leaned in, lowering his voice. "You know what folks are saying, don't you?" "Don't much care. They're saying those boys came from a wagon that got hit, that the men who did it are still around." Carson's eyes narrowed. "Where'd you hear that?" "Couple riders came through yesterday, asking questions. Said they were looking for two kids. Said they were witnesses. Carson felt something cold settle in his gut. They give names? Petey shook his head. Didn't ask. Figured it wasn't my business. Carson took the package and dropped a few coins on the counter. If they come back, you don't know me. And you sure as hell don't know anything about two boys. Petey swallowed hard. Sure, Hale. Whatever you say. Carson walked out. When he got back to the ranch, Eli was sitting on the porch steps, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife. He looked up as Carson dismounted. Samuel awake? Carson asked. Eli nodded. He drank some water. Ate a little. Carson carried the package inside. Samuel was sitting up on the cot, his back against the wall. His face was still pale, but his eyes were clearer. How you feelin'? Carson asked. Hurts, Samuel said quietly. I know. We'll get you fixed up. Carson unwrapped the bandages and salve and set them on the table. He looked at Eli, who had followed him inside. You ever set a bone before? Carson asked. Eli shook his head. Then watch close. You might need to know. Carson worked slow, careful. He reset Samuel's ankle as gently as he could, the boy biting down on a strip of leather to keep from screaming. When it was done, Carson wrapped it tight and gave him a small dose of laudanum. Sleep now, Carson said. Samuel's eyes fluttered closed. Eli stood near the door, arms crossed, watching. They're coming, aren't they? Eli said. Carson looked at him. Who? The men who killed my parents. They know we're still out here. Carson didn't answer right away. He wiped his hands on a rag and stood. Yeah, he said finally. They're coming. Eli's jaw tightened. What are we going to do? Carson met his eyes. We're going to be ready. They came 2 days later. Carson was in the barn, mending a saddle strap when he heard the hoofbeats. 3 horses, maybe 4, moving slow. He set down the leather and walked to the barn door. Eli was already there, standing just inside the shadow, his hand resting on a pitchfork leaning against the wall. Stay here, Carson said. Eli didn't move. Carson stepped out into the yard. The sun was high, the air still. 3 men rode up to the edge of the property and stopped. They didn't dismount. The one in the middle had a scar running from his temple to his jaw. The one on the left wore a brown coat, torn at the shoulder. The third was younger, maybe 20, with a nervous look in his eyes. Carson stood in the center of the yard, hands loose at his sides. Help you? He asked. The man with the scar smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Maybe. We're looking for a couple boys. Young ones. Heard they might have passed through here. Haven't seen any boys, Carson said. The man tilted his head. That's so. That's so. The man in the brown coat leaned forward in his saddle. You sure? 'Cause the man at the store said you bought a lot of bandages the other day. Funny thing to buy if you're living alone. Carson's jaw tightened. I cut myself. Happens. The man with the scar chuckled. You must cut yourself a lot. Carson didn't respond. The younger man shifted in his saddle, eyes darting toward the house. Maybe we should just take a look around. Make sure you're not looking around, Carson said. His voice was flat, final. The man with the scar's smile faded. Now that's not very neighborly. Didn't invite you to be neighbors. The tension thickened. The horses shifted, sensing it. The man with the scar leaned back in his saddle, studying Carson. You know what I think? I think you're lying. I think those boys are here, and I think you're making a mistake protecting them. Carson didn't blink. Only mistake here is yours. You're trespassing, and I'm asking you to leave. The man's eyes went cold. We'll leave, but we'll be back. And next time, we won't ask. He turned his horse and the other 2 followed. They rode off slowly, deliberately, kicking up dust as they disappeared down the trail. Carson stood in the yard until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Then he turned and walked back to the barn. Eli was still standing in the shadow, his knuckles white around the pitchfork handle. They're coming back, Eli said. I know. What are we going to do? Carson looked at him. The boy's face was hard, but his hands were shaking. We're going to be smart, Carson said. and we're going to be ready. That night, Carson didn't sleep. He sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap, watching the road. The moon was a sliver, casting just enough light to see by. The wind moved through the grass like something restless. Inside, Samuel was asleep. Eli sat near the window, staring out into the dark. "You should sleep," Carson said without turning around. "Can't." Carson didn't argue. "Why are you helping us?" Eli asked after a long silence. Carson didn't answer right away. He ran his thumb along the stock of the rifle, feeling the grain of the wood. "I had a son once," he said finally. "Long time ago." Eli didn't say anything. "He was about your age. Got sick one winter. Fever took him in 3 days. The wind picked up, rattling the porch boards. I wasn't here when it happened," Carson continued. "I was out on a cattle drive, 2 weeks away. By the time I got back, he was already buried." He paused. His mother left a month later, said she couldn't stay in a house full of ghosts. Eli was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry." Carson shook his head. "Don't be. Just telling you why." "Why what?" "Why I'm not letting you go. Why I'm not letting them take you." Eli looked at him. "You think we're gonna die, don't you?" Carson turned to face him. "No, I think we're gonna fight, and I think we're gonna win." Eli's eyes searched his face. "How do you know?" "Because I'm not losing anyone else." They came at dawn. Carson saw them from the porch, 5 riders this time, moving fast. The man with the scar was in the lead. Carson stood and walked to the center of the yard, rifle in hand. Eli stepped out behind him, holding the pitchfork. "Get back inside," Carson said. "No." Carson didn't have time to argue. The riders pulled up 20 feet away. The man with the scar dismounted, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Last chance," the man said. "Hand over the boys, and we ride out. No one gets hurt." Carson raised the rifle and leveled it at the man's chest. "No." The man's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake. Seems to be my specialty." The man with the scar reached for his gun. Carson fired. The shot echoed across the valley, and the man dropped to the ground, clutching his shoulder. The other riders scattered, pulling their own weapons. Chaos erupted. Carson dove behind a water trough as bullets tore through the air. Eli scrambled back toward the house, dragging Samuel with him. Carson fired twice more, hitting one of the riders in the leg. The man screamed and fell from his horse. Another rider charged forward, pistol raised. Carson levered another round and fired. The man jerked back and tumbled from the saddle. The remaining 2 riders turned and fled, leaving their wounded behind. Carson stayed low, breathing hard, the rifle hot in his hands. The yard was quiet again. Smoke drifted in the air. The man with the scar lay in the dirt, bleeding. Carson stood slowly and walked over. The man looked up at him, teeth bared. "Should have killed me," the man rasped. Carson looked down at him. "Should have left." He turned and walked back to the house. The wounded men were gone by noon. Carson dragged them to the edge of the property and left them there. If they could walk, they'd walk. If they couldn't, that wasn't his problem anymore. He came back to the house, washed the blood from his hands, and sat down at the table. His ribs ached where he'd hit the ground. His shoulder was bruised from the rifle's recoil. Eli sat across from him, silent. Samuel was asleep again, his breathing steadier now. "You killed them," Eli said quietly. "2 of them," Carson said. "The rest ran. Will they come back?" "No." Eli looked down at his hands. "How do you know?" "Because they're cowards, and cowards don't come back after they lose." Eli nodded slowly. Then he looked up. "Thank you." Carson met his eyes. "Don't thank me yet." "Why not?" "Because this isn't over." "Not really." Eli frowned. "What do you mean?" Carson leaned back in his chair. "Those men are gone, but people in town are going to talk. They're going to ask questions. And sooner or later someone's going to come asking why there's blood in my yard and why I've got 2 boys living here. What are we supposed to do?" Carson sighed. "You stay. You work. You don't draw attention, and you let me handle the rest." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Over the next few days, life settled into a rhythm. Samuel's ankle healed slowly. He could sit up now, and he'd started eating more. His color was coming back. Eli worked. He fed the horses, mended fences, hauled water from the creek. He didn't complain, didn't ask for anything. Carson watched him and saw himself, or maybe what he used to be, before the loss, before the silence. One evening, Carson was splitting wood behind the barn when Eli came out carrying a tin plate with 2 biscuits and a piece of salted pork. "Thought you might be hungry," Eli said. Carson set down the axe and took the plate. "Thanks." Eli sat on a log nearby, watching the sun sink behind the hills. "Samuel asked about you today," Eli said. "Yeah?" "He wanted to know if you were our pa now." Carson paused, biscuit halfway to his mouth. He set it down. "What'd you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know." Carson didn't respond right away. He stared at the pile of split wood, the axe blade glinting in the fading light. "I'm not your pa," he said finally. "But you're not going anywhere. Not unless you want to." Eli looked at him. "What if we want to stay?" Carson met his eyes. "Then you stay." Eli nodded. "Okay." They sat in silence for a while, the sky turning from orange to purple. "You ever think about leaving?" Eli asked. "Going somewhere else?" Carson shook his head. "This is all I got, but—" "You're alone." "Not anymore." Eli looked down at his boots. "I used to think being alone was the worst thing, but it's not." "What is?" "Being with people who don't see you." Carson studied the boy. "Your folks saw you." "Yeah." Eli's voice was soft. "They did." Carson picked up the biscuit and took a bite. "Then they raised you right." That night, Samuel woke up screaming. Carson bolted from his bed and rushed to the cot. Samuel was thrashing, eyes wide, tangled in the blanket. "Hey, hey," Carson said, gripping the boy's shoulders gently. "You're safe. You're here." Samuel's eyes darted around the room, wild and unfocused. "Where's Mama?" Carson's chest tightened. "She's gone, son." "I'm sorry." Samuel's face crumpled. He started to cry, deep, broken sobs that shook his whole body. Carson pulled him close, holding him like he'd held his own son once, like he should have been there to hold him. "I got you," Carson murmured. "You're safe. I got you." Eli appeared in the doorway, his face pale. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the cot, his hand resting on his brother's back. "It's okay, Sam," Eli whispered. "We're okay." Samuel clung to Carson, his small hands gripping the man's shirt. They stayed like that for a long time. Spring came early that year. The valley turned green. The creek swelled with snowmelt, and the air smelled like rain and new grass. Samuel was walking again, slowly at first, with a limp, but he was walking. He spent his days helping Eli with the chores, laughing when the chickens scattered, chasing the ranch dog through the yard. Carson watched them from the porch, coffee in hand, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. One afternoon, a man rode up to the ranch. He was older, gray-haired, with a star pinned to his vest. Carson stepped off the porch, rifle within reach but not in hand. "Sheriff," Carson said. The man tipped his hat. "Hail. Something I can do for you?" The sheriff dismounted and looked around the yard. His eyes lingered on Eli and Samuel, who had stopped working and were watching from near the barn. "Heard there was some trouble out here a few weeks back," the sheriff said. "There was. Men came looking for those boys, I'm told, and some of them didn't leave." Carson crossed his arms. "They came looking for trouble. Found it." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed. "I'm not here to arrest you, Hale. I'm here to ask what you want to do with them." "With who?" "The boys." Carson's jaw tightened. "They're staying." "You sure about that?" "They've got family back east. An aunt, I think. I can make arrangements." "No." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "You planning to raise them yourself?" "If they'll have me." The sheriff looked over at Eli and Samuel, then back at Carson. "You know what you're signing up for?" I do. The sheriff was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. All right, I'll file the papers. Make it official. Appreciate it. The sheriff climbed back onto his horse. You're a good man, Hale. Better than most. Carson didn't respond. The sheriff rode off, and Carson turned back to the house. Eli was standing on the porch, arms crossed, his face unreadable. We're staying? Eli asked. If you want to. Eli looked at Samuel, who was grinning wide. Then he looked back at Carson. Yeah, Eli said. We want to. The years that followed were hard. They worked the land, mended fences, drove cattle to market. Samuel grew strong, his limp fading to a slight hitch. Eli grew tall, his hands steady and capable. Carson taught them everything he knew: how to read the sky, how to mend leather, how to shoot straight and speak true. They fought sometimes, argued over chores, over money, over the small, stubborn things that families fight about, but they stayed. Years later, when Carson was old and his hands shook too much to hold a rifle steady, he sat on the porch and watched Eli and Samuel working the fence line. Eli was a man now, broad-shouldered and steady. Samuel rode beside him, laughing at something his brother said. Carson closed his eyes and felt the sun on his face. He thought about the day he found them on that road, the boy standing in the dust, holding his hat, the question that changed everything. Sir, can you carry my brother? He'd carried them both. Not just that day. Every day after. And they'd carried him too. When Carson died, it was in his sleep, in his own bed, with Eli and Samuel sitting beside him. They buried him on the hill overlooking the valley, beneath a cottonwood tree that swayed in the wind. Eli carved the headstone himself. Carson Hale. He carried us home. Samuel stood beside him, hat in hand, the way their father had taught them. The wind moved through the grass, and the valley was quiet.